Okay, so in this last video, we're going to go over the vertebrae. We will start with just kind of identifying the cervical, the thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. So here are these cervical vertebrae. The best way to remember how many there are of each is the whole little 7, 12, 5 breakfast, lunch, and dinner mnemonic. So 7 is when you eat breakfast. There are 7 cervical vertebrae. To note are C1 and C2. C1 is the atlas that articulates with the skull, specifically at the occipital condyle of the occipital bone. And then the axis is just below, and that is C2. And then the rest are C3, 4, 5, 6, and C7. And that is our cervical vertebrae. Now we'll look at the thoracic vertebrae, 12 of them. This is a posterior view. And then finally the lumbar vertebrae. Of which there are 5. L1, 2, 3, 4, and L5. Thoracic vertebrae were T1 through T12. Now it is important to know for this course how to differentiate between the 3 types of vertebrae. So let's just take a typical cervical vertebra and take a look at it from a lateral view. So this is anterior, posterior. I think the most characteristic feature of the cervical vertebrae is this bifid spinous process. So we will go over all the terms on our list, but just to quickly point out two, the part that sticks out, the process, so this is the posterior aspect, that is known as the spinous process. And the spinous processes of the cervical vertebrae are all they're bifurcated, so they have 2 little points, and that is known as a bifid spinous process. And that is kind of the telltale sign of the cervical vertebrae. In addition to the atlas and the axis having a couple of important features that we'll review. For a thoracic vertebra, we'll just pick a random one. I would say that the telltale feature is this spinous process that is kind of dipped downwards. They kind of extend downwards at this angle here. So this is a posterior view. We'll go over these terms. But this spinous process kind of sticks downward and the body is a lot thicker. And then when you look at a lumbar vertebra, the spinous process is pretty thick and it's very short. It doesn't stick out very much. And the body is the biggest out of all of them. It's a very thick body. So let's see if we can select one of each and try to just kind of quickly compare them. So there you go. It's a cervical vertebra with a bifid spinous process, a thoracic vertebra with a larger body, and an angled downwards spinous process, and then a lumbar vertebra with a very large body and a very short, thick spinous process. Here's another good angle. Okay, so now what we can do is that we can start going over some of these terms. So we went over the cervical vertebra, the atlas C1. We've seen a couple of times. Remember, atlas holds the world on its shoulders, and in fact the atlas is holding the entirety of the skull on its shoulders. So the atlas C1, the axis is C2, right below, and the important feature is the dens of the axis. Let's see if we can. So this process right here is the dens of the axis. Feel free to pause the video and read descriptions, but I won't do that for you. So here's an anterior view, and the dens is going to articulate with the atlas. So let's select the atlas and the axis, and we can see how the dens extends into the atlas and articulates with it. And these kind of lighter surfaces are where those the parts of those bones touch. So here's a lateral view. This is anterior. This is posterior. And that is the dens of the axis articulating with the atlas. So our next term, bifid, we went over. Those are the bifid spinous processes of the cervical vertebrae. Thoracic vertebra, we went over. The ribs, we will have more specific structures, I think, concerning the ribs later on. But right now, just be able to realize that the ribs articulate with the thoracic vertebrae. So there are the ribs articulating with the thoracic vertebrae. That's rib number 1, first rib, 12th rib floating in our thoracic vertebrae. Finally, the lumbar vertebrae, which we took a look at, and their kind of characteristics. So now the next set of terms, from spinous process to body, those all pertain to the individual parts of a vertebra. So let's just select a random one. Looks like we're looking at T4. And let's look at some of the parts. So the spinous process, again, it's the segment that sticks out. Remember, processes are kind of just parts that stick out of bones or out of parts. So here's a lateral aspect. Over here is anterior. Here's posterior. And recall that the thoracic vertebrae have spinous processes that kind of are angled downward. Transverse processes are also these parts that stick out, but they do so kind of from side to side. They transverse the vertebra. And realize that just like the spinous process, that the transverse processes of different ribs are kind of all different lengths and widths as well. So if we were to look at, the transverse process of a lumbar vertebra, that these are slightly different in angle and shape than the others. Here's a spinous process. The vertebral foramen. Remember, foramens are, or foramina, are openings. There's our vertebral foramen, and that is essentially where the spine is going to pass through. So let's look at a cervical vertebra and check out its right in the middle there, the vertebral foramen. Transverse foramens, or foramina. Let's go ahead and find a cervical vertebra. So here's another distinguishing feature of the cervical vertebrae. They are going to have these transverse foramina. So if we pick out C7 and look at it from a superior aspect, down here is anterior, posterior, we have the spinous process, the transverse process, the vertebral foramen, and over here we have transverse foramina. The lamina can be viewed from a posterior aspect, and they're essentially these kind of planes that lie in between the spinous process and the transverse processes. So it's this area in between the two that are known as the lamina. So let's look at the lamina of a different vertebra. Let's pick out this guy here. And I mean, this is essentially the lamina right here, right where the arrow is. I think maybe we can actually so lamina, spinous process, transverse processes here. The pedicles let's try to find a better view so you guys can get a sense of what the pedicles are. The pedicles are essentially the segment of the vertebra that are going to connect it, that are going to connect the transverse processes to the body. So here's a superior view, posterior, anterior. You can see the transverse processes, and that the pedicle is kind of the region that connects that process, here's the lamina, to the body. So right in between. Let's find a different vertebra and take a look. Okay, so these are the pedicles. And then our last term is the body, and that's just the thickest part there. So this is L4, body, pedicle, lamina, transverse process, no transverse foramen, vertebral foramen, transverse process, spinous process. And then the last two terms for this quiz are going to be the sacrum and the coccyx. Well, actually. So the sacrum is going to be this big guy right here, this big fused bone. Looks like that articulates with L5. And then the final bone that we'll need to know is your tailbone, coccyx, and that is your vertebrae. Those are your vertebrae.